What is going on, folks? Welcome back as always. Hopefully, you're having a great week. We're moving into section 8, which is looking at labeling theory and the intricacies of labeling theory, the early development of labeling theory, um, and how you can use it today and understand it. It's one of those pretty easy to understand theories, at least in my opinion. So, labeling theory is a symbolic interactionist perspective. It's using a micro level. We're looking at the individual here, not necessarily the structures of society. Um, it's a relativist perspective that essentially focuses on individuals and the meanings that are attached to objects, people, and interactions. Generally speaking, when we're talking about symbolic interactions, we're talking about meaning. What's the meaning that we assign to things in society, and why is that important, and how does that impact us, and essentially how does that impact us in relationship to deviance. Um, uh, when we're talking about symbolic interactionists, we're talking about direct observation of the social world as it is experienced and understood by the individuals in it. So the way we perceive the social cues that we're receiving from others is extremely important here. Labeling theorists examine the social meaning of deviant labels and how those labels are understood and how they impact the individuals to which the labels are attached. Um, Labeling is important. The classic example is the bad kid in school that is labeled a bad kid early on, and um, over the course of the child's uh, evolution, growth, if you will, they turn into a bad kid. They turn into um, a person that tends to break the social norms, and they succumb to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Deviance, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, especially in this perspective, and the reaction is the key in defining deviance. No act is thought to be inherently deviant. However, acts are judged depending on the context and the response. So, deviance, of course, here is relative based on the group and the time that it's being defined. When we look at these theories a little more in depth, we see that deviance is a status imposed on an individual or a group which may or may not be related to the actual rule breaking. Reactions versus norm violations are some things that we need to think about. Another thing can be labeled without actually fulfilling the label. And we have to keep in mind the power impacts status of a label as well. So power plays a real clear example here. Some individuals have the power to reject or pass along labels while others do not. Some questions that we should think about is what is labeled as deviant, who is labeled as deviant, and under what circumstances. When we think about some of these things, I put a song in the section 8 material called Alice's Restaurant. And, think about this idea of deviance as a status imposed on an individual or a group which may or may not be related to the actual rule breaking. And this song, Alice's Restaurant, which I encourage you to listen to, is a real clear indication of this. And the individual in the beginning breaks a rule. He litters, and you fast forward to the end of the song, and you see how that clearly unrelated event works its way into different labels for this individual when it comes to being drafted. Some early labeling theorists, Franklin Tannenbaum's 1938 labeling theory, looked at how police contact and or intervention has the ability to potentially turn relatively common acts of juvenile delinquency into a dramatization of evil. Once the labels are attached to the acts individuals are involved in and seen as negative, there's a societal reaction that can lead to further deviant acts. So once again, when you label someone deviant, and then society starts to react to that label, then those people who may not have been as all that deviant with the initial act can become much more deviant. Sex offenders is a great example that they looked at throughout the chapter, and many people who find themselves on the sex offender list are there for reasons that might not be what society views as sex offenders, yet the label is still used to stigmatize these individuals, and society closes its doors to them, and it's not surprising to see many of these engage in more, or many of these types of people engage in more types of deviance. Edwin Lemert, in 1951, comes out with Social Pathology. He's looking at primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is a common violation of norms. Individuals don't view themselves as being involved in a deviant social role. And these tend to be the instances of deviance rather than chronic deviance. This is that maybe the first time a person ever engages in deviance, and they have not set a pattern of deviance up at this moment. Teenage drinking, especially early on, along with his or her friends, falls into this category. Now, primary deviance can lead into secondary deviance. This is when the individual engages in deviant behavior as a means of defense, attack, or adjustment to the problems created by the labels and reactions to the labels. This is that self-fulfilling prophecy that we were talking about earlier. That teenage drinker that gets caught at a party and is either shown leniency, maybe given a warning, or is arrested and thrown in jail and given a permanent record. There's good evidence that the one shown leniency might take that slap on the wrist and change their behavior, whereas the one that is labeled and thrown in jail could fall into a rut that continues them down the road of deviance, especially as the system starts to construct them in reference to that deviance. How does the process work? Well, of course, you've got the deviant act, which then leads to the reaction from society. Once the reaction happens, the individual begins to become engulfed in the role that society lays out for them, and they ultimately engage in a secondary form of deviance. Each stage is reciprocal and or circular. Back and forth is possible. You have to remember that the process is not necessarily as direct as the diagram depicts. And you also have to remember that once on the path to deviance, one can interact with an environment and choose not to be deviant. This is not a deterministic thing. This is not once you get on that path, you can no longer get off of it. And we also have to remember that there's no guarantee that an individual will fall into a deviant role. This is not set in stone. The individual can choose a different path, and that's important. There's three important ways that labeling can actually lead us down a path to secondary deviance. First is altering an individual's self-concept. So once you begin to label somebody, they start to think of themselves differently. It also limits conforming opportunities and encourages involvement in deviant subcultures. So once you label somebody, nobody wants to hang out with them, and therefore they end up in groups that might not be good for them in the long run. And it might not just be good, or it might not just be bad for them. It could actually lead into what we refer to as a deviant master status, or a status that proves to be more important than most others. Deviant master statuses shape the perception and behaviors of those around you. It's what people see of you first and foremost, before they get to all of the other important characteristics of an individual's character. This is the master status. If you're a criminal, for example, that is a master status, and when people look at you, that might be the first thing that they see. Or maybe you're a murderer, or maybe you're just a really nice person. What is it that they see, and how do they define you in reference to that master status? Labeling theory is not only used to define deviance, it has been used to define mental illness, which of course mental illness is a form of deviance. Sheff talks about this and says that mental illness begins with primary deviance, which he called residual rule breaking. Residual rule breaking, or deviance in which no clear category exists. Here we're drawing attention and making the societal audience uncomfortable. It's not necessarily a crime. Maybe it's inappropriate dress, conversations, interactions. Someone steps up to you and steps into your personal space and kisses you, for example, and your wife is right next to you. Well, that's going to draw attention, and that's going to create some discomfort. It's not necessarily against the law, but it's going to make some people feel uncomfortable. This also comes from diverse sources, biological, psychological, or situational conditions. For example, after a breakup, someone stays in bed for a week. Now, if that person is left by themselves, and this happens quite often, where someone goes through a breakup, they stay home, they order in, they don't get in, they might call in sick to work. But if they do that by themselves, they're not going to be labeled deviant. If someone else comes along, finds you, encourages you to go to a psychiatrist, you might be labeled clinically depressed, and the way that works out is going to be a lot different than if you were just left by yourself. Symptoms and stereotypes inadvertently are reaffirmed in this process. What we have to keep in mind is, can they resume regular activities and return to conventional lives once diagnosed with this mental illness, or does all social interactions change around them? This is extremely important, how the labeling process works and then how it's reinforced by those around you.